Good morning. My name is Russell Lowe. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Professor Raymond Menegus. Ray served as a professor in the Department of Mathematics at San Diego State University for 11 years. Upon his retirement 20 years ago, to our benefit, Ray returned to his first love, drawing, painting, and sculpture. He has been a docent for San Diego Museum of Art, where our own Lily Birmingham was one of his instructors. Now, Ray characterizes himself as a student of art history, but Ray is not satisfied with simply admiring art. His interest in art history is focused more on the questions of how a work of art is produced. He delves deeply into the processes and ancient techniques that go into creating these beautiful pieces. Now, to understand how works of art and lacquer are made, Ray set out to learn the process of making lacquer art, and then remarkably, he applied these techniques to produce his very own carved lacquer box. Today, Ray will share with us his expertise describing the path of this incredibly creative journey. Ray?
Ray, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Russ. That was a beautiful introduction, and I'm really humbled by being here because I understand very well that there are many people in this room that know more about Chinese lacquer than I do. So I am an amateur at this, and my hope and my goal this morning is that through my efforts at making Chinese carved lacquer box and then trying to do inlay with mother of pearl and abalone, you will appreciate not only the beauty, the danger that the artists faced in making these works, but also the beauty of the materials and just the effort and the creativity of the artists. When you see my meager attempts, you will gain an understanding and hopefully an appreciation of the works made by these wonderful Chinese artists. So this morning, we will look at carved lacquer and the process by which the lacquer was made. And then the second part will be on mother of pearl inlay. Along the way, I will show you some beautiful pieces of art, but my attempt is not to give you the history of the art, but to, again, to focus on how these objects were made. So on your screen, you can see a Chinese carved lacquer box. And as Russ said, when I was studying the works of China under the direction of Lily B, I saw a work much like this. And as we were in the gallery looking at a scene of a literati of the scholar being attended by two attendants in this pavilion, we learned a lot about the Song dynasty and the work of art at that time. But as the class separated, I started looking more carefully at the box because my interest is in the materials and how things are made. And so we started reading about this, and people said that this is not wood, carved wood. This is actually a wooden box with many, many layers of lacquer built up onto the surface. And then after the surface had built up to a thickness of about 3 to 5 millimeters, which you can see casts these deep shadows, giving you an indication of the thickness of the lacquer, then the artists set themselves the task of carving these beautiful images onto the surface of the lacquer. And so I needed to know how this was done. And so this was the inspiration for my attempt to understand Chinese carved lacquer. So what is lacquer? In China, there's a species of a sumac tree called Rus venusifera, and it grows native to China. And here you have an image of what that tree looks like. The trees take about 10 years to grow before the sap, the sumac, can be harvested. Between June and September, while the flowers are on the trees, the gardeners can slices into the tree, and you can see, starting at the bottom, as the summer proceeds, they're slicing more and more slices and collecting very little sap from each slice. By the end of the summer and beginning of the fall, the result of all this is that the trees end up dying as the white milky sap is collected. The sap is stored in a cool environment, and but not all is lost with the trees. 6 or 7 saplings grow up from the roots of the trees, so that later, in a few more years, the harvest can continue. So the sap is stored in a cool environment, but then when it's ready to be used, it is heated and filtered before it can be applied to a surface. Now, what's the danger of this? The danger is that, much like the poison oak that we have in our canyons here, this is a very poisonous to the skin, creating lumps and welts on the skin. And also, if you breathe it for an extended period of time, it can cause respiratory disease. So there is a danger to working with the lacquer. The artisans in China can build up a tolerance to it, but it's still a severely dangerous material. Now, in ancient times, they would use 3 different materials to pigment the lacquer. So carbon, which is soot, it comes from the imperfect combustion of woody material, can be used to give and create a black lacquer. It's also the same material that was used in the black ink that was used in calligraphy and in paintings. The second material that was used, and probably the more important, was cinnabar. Cinnabar, and here we see a picture of the ore that you could get out of the ground, and China had vast deposits of cinnabar. And if this was ground and purified, the red powder could be used to give the beautiful red color, which was very important to the Chinese people at the time, and still probably the most important color. Coincidental with the Ming Dynasty in the East, we had the Renaissance in Europe, and Rome considered cinnabar to be the most, which is vermilion, the most beautiful and expensive color. It was controlled by the Roman government at the time, and so the market was very prized. Here we see crystals of cinnabar, which is also a very poisonous substance. It's mercury sulfide. It was so it is so dangerous that the very famous Isaac Newton, who used to do a lot of studies with mercury, went crazy for a period of few years. And so again, the artists would subject themselves to the dangers of working with mercuric sulfide. And here we see it in its powdered form. The third pigment that was used, not as extensively, is orpiment, which gave lacquer a yellow color. And here again, we see the ore version of the pigment, but it also crystallized in certain veins. And so you can see the beautiful yellow color of this material. Orpiment is arsenic sulfide. And you don't have to know very much to know how hazardous working is with arsenic. So we know a little bit about the dangers of the sumac and the pigments that were used to give colors, but how is the works achieved? How do we actually carve lacquer? So I did not have the resources to fly to China to acquire a wooden box. So instead, I went to Michael's and I bought a little small wooden box, probably made in China. And I went to the art store in Hillcrest and I was able to purchase cadmium red pigment, which is close in color to vermilion, close in color to the cinnabar. It's a little redder. Cinnabar is a little more towards the orange, and some bone black or carbon black pigments. We don't have available Chinese sumac here, so I went to Home Depot and got a synthetics lacquer. I knew I would need a brush and something to carve the lacquer with. Now, before an artist starts the process, the artist has to know what he's going to attempt to do. And so I had seen enough carved lacquer boxes and trays and things to know that I wanted to start by applying a few layers of black lacquer before I applied layers of red lacquer. My attempt was to carve down through the red to expose the black lacquer underneath. But immediately I encountered a problem. It's very difficult to find any of the actual techniques that the Chinese artists used. As Mr. Liu has taught me, many of these techniques were involved in a family, and the family guarded the secrets very well. And so what I did was I put some of my carbon pigment into the sumac, not knowing the concentrations or the proportions. And then I brushed it onto the wood. And to my disappointment, all these little bumps were on the wood surface. So I knew something was wrong. And so I had in my kitchen a small mortar and pestle. And so what I had to do was grind the carbon to even finer so that the particles could suspend themselves in the sumac or in the lacquer without creating little bumps. So after some effort and experimentation, I finally got proportions and the fineness of the grain so that I could achieve a beautifully smooth surface on the wood. Now, lacquer has this incredible property of drying very slowly. And as it dries slowly, it comes to a perfectly flat surface under gravity. In other words, you could, with a very coarse brush, apply the lacquer such that you could see all the brushwork, but the lacquer itself would simply smooth itself out over time. Now, in China, the Chinese sumac does not air dry. It's a chemical reaction that needs to happen at a precise high temperature and high humidity, because that's not drying. That's actually a chemical reaction by which the liquid sumac turns into a plastic. It is the original organic plastic, and so it was a very prized material. The material itself is tolerates acids, water, and it's a beautiful and very resilient material. Well, after applying about 7 layers of lacquer to the surface, I started applying the red lacquer. I had the good fortune that the red already came in fine enough particles. I didn't have to grind it much, but I still ground it in my mortar and pestle with the lacquer. And you can see that even after the first applications, you could see through the translucency of the material to the black that's still underneath. And I kept going. And after working for 5 months, this is where I ended up. By this point, I knew that I was only going to carve the surface or of the top of the lacquer box. And so I didn't apply as many layers to the sides of the box as I did to the top. There are 250 layers of lacquer on this surface. And I hope you can appreciate that each layer with real sumac takes a week to dry before you can apply the next. So it would take the Chinese artists years, sometimes a year or two or more, to actually build up the lacquer to a sufficient thickness so that it could be carved. Well, I wish I could see all your faces, but at this point, I was now scared. Why am I scared? Because I had to apply a knife to this. And what was I going to carve? And was I able to achieve anything? Well, I knew I couldn't attempt the literati pavilion scene that was so beautiful at the beginning. And so I decided to look around for some images, and I ended up trying to carve a longevity symbol on the top of it. Now, please look at this carefully. It's a terrible carving job. I mean, if you compare this to any of the Chinese lacquer boxes that you see, you can see how difficult it is to achieve what they were able to do. Lacquer yields itself to a knife very easily. When I first put my X-Acto blade into the surface, I wanted to carve down to the black, but it yields so well, it carves so beautifully that I went all the way through the red, all the way through the black, right down to the wood. And I was really sad and disappointed. And so I had to very carefully carve this out by hand. It's hard to see maybe, but the thickness of the red lacquer is 3 millimeters. And you can see and hopefully appreciate the skill and the craftsmanship of the Chinese artists that were able to do the works that I'm now going to show you. So here, carved lacquer started in the Southern Song, and here we have an early example of carved lacquer, and this is the cinnabar red, and you can see all the way through to the wood. So the artist did not apply a layer of black lacquer under, and they carved all the way down to the wood. What's also important about this work is you see a very ubiquitous motif, namely the two pheasants or two phoenix birds that are represented in Chinese art very often. Here we have also a song carved box. The importance of this one for me was that it actually has the 3 different pigments, the red, the yellow, and the black, although I don't really see in this photograph the red pigment so much. It might be that I'm looking at well, it's called the 3 colored pigment, so it had to be red at this time period. Here's another example of a motif that's carved into a tea bowl, which is called a sword pommel, which is also a very a motif that is seen very often in carved lacquer. And then you can see the stability of the images and of the forms in China, where again, we're at the Yuan dynasty, and you can see again the 2 bird motif carved into the black lacquer. Now, if I am at an antiques roadshow or at a garage sale, or maybe at Catherine Jones' home, rummaging around in her attic, I would be looking for an example of carved lacquer. Now, to identify it, can you see all these little cracks and imperfections in the lacquer? Just about every work of art that I've seen from the Song dynasty through the Ming dynasties all have these slight imperfections, because as the lacquer is subjected to the elements and oxidation, these cracks appear. In other words, if I don't see those cracks, I know that it's a recent production, and it wouldn't be an original. Again, the images that are carved and the way the images are carved also tell us something about the period. But Andy can tell us more about that in his portion of the talk. And here is a wonderful example from the Ming Dynasty, and scholars attribute the Ming Dynasty to the absolute pinnacle of carved lacquer in China. This is the work of art that we have at our museum, the San Diego Museum of Art, that inspired my little carved lacquer box. So I cannot read the symbols, but on the very top of the box is the symbol of longevity that I chose for my little box. But I'm also told that all these other calligraphic symbols are also different variations of the word longevity. You can see how the artist carved through the red down to the black lacquer, and then all the different little geometric forms that they were able to achieve in the lacquer. I'm reminded of a movie, Amadeus, that I saw many, many years ago. Amadeus is about the relationship between Mozart and Salieri, an Italian composer. Salieri was a talented court composer in Vienna, but Mozart was a genius. One day, Salieri goes into Mozart's home, and he's able to find some music sheets that Mozart had read. And as he saw the genius that was on the pages, he almost fainted and the music dropped out of his hand. Why do I say that? Because when I look at a work of art, a Chinese lacquer box, I almost faint because I understand the level of artistry and craftsmanship and effort that goes into producing something like this. And I know that I could never do it. And so I feel like Salieri when I see works of art like this. Here we have a Qing Dynasty bowl with some beautifully carved, again, these images are carved in through the red lacquer into the black. And I'm told that this represents a poem. Here is a carved lacquer box that you have in your collection. And I'm not sure what the size is because I haven't seen it personally, but some carved lacquer boxes are used to keep prized utensils, maybe pens and things like that. And I'm showing you this one that I found on the internet because it's an example of multi-layers of multi-colors. You see the yellow, the red, and the black. Each line that you see carved into the box represents many, many layers of lacquer. And so here you have, again, probably a couple of hundred layers of lacquer of different colors built up onto the box before the artist begins carving onto the surface of the box. And furniture was also carved. I would imagine that something like this involves a workshop of people, because as I look at the details of each of these benches, I can see that they are not the same. So I would venture to say that different individual artists were involved with carving each of the benches and the tabletop that you see. And here's another fine example from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So in addition to carving on wood, not as many, but many carved lacquer were also achieved on copper alloys like brass. Here's an example from your collection of a snuff bottle. And the impressive thing of this is that you have a brass bottle the lacquer is built up on the surface of the bottle, and the artist has to have an image that goes all the way around the bottle and ends right where it begins. In other words, the entire image has to be thought out very carefully before the carving begins. This is another small carved lacquer on brass in your collection. The impressive thing about this is before the lacquer was applied, the brass had to be formed, and then inside it has a beautifully blue enamel surface. Enamel is a combination of colored pigment and glass, which had to be fired in a kiln so that it would all melt smoothly onto the surface. And all of that had to take place before the lacquer was applied and carved. And probably one of the finest examples, again from the London Museum, is this vase. This is two sides of the vase. It's only one vase. And again, the image has to unite with itself as you go all the way around it. So the next technique I want to address is inlay of mother of pearl. There are two basic techniques. One is dry and one is wet. And I will speak principally about the dry technique. About 2 weeks ago, the museum shared with me the images that Mr. Liu is going to show us. And in his collection, he has some very fine mother of pearl inlay. So here we see a top of a box with probably mother of pearl and abalone shells inlaid onto the surface. So last weekend, I said to myself, I need to do this for myself also. How is this achieved? And so I set myself the task of trying to create an inlay. Now, I want you to note before I go on, every little speck that you see, this little bud, these little limbs, little petals of the flower, these little triangular decorations on the side, each of those have been sawn off of either a mother of pearl shell, an oyster shell, or the green here might be an abalone shell, or perhaps some other kind of mollusk or sea snail or seashell. Every single part is hand sewn with a saw. So what is mother of pearl? Oyster shells, the oyster secretes a material that is called nacre, N-A-C-R-E. And that material coats the interior of the oyster shell. And as the shell grows, it keeps secreting this material. If an impurity gets into the oyster, the oyster tries to cover that impurity, and that eventually turns into a pearl. So mother of pearl is the shell that gives rise to the pearl, and that material is nacre. It is a beautiful iridescent material, and it is prized to create the decorations that are inlay. Here is a blow up of an abalone shell, and you can see the beautiful colors and the layers that are deposited on the surface of the abalone shell. And this is what has attracted the artist to the inlay techniques. So nacre, here on the right, I have an electron microscope photograph of the material. And you can see that these layers are mostly calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate, you can take, it's chalk if you draw on a board with white chalk, but here it's in a form of layers. On the left, I have a cartoon, and in between the layers, there's an organic material. It is a polymer of sugars called chitin that suspends one layer above the other. So it's a combination of inorganic minerals with organic materials that are all created by the oyster shell. Now, one thing I didn't know until Mr. Liu explained to me, and he will give us some more insight, is that I knew that the Chinese artists of the past somehow were able to take the thick shells and separate the layers apart. And he'll describe that in more detail. But the reason the abalone and the mother of pearl give us these beautiful colors is that the light that comes down and reflects off of different planes creates the interference of the light that creates all the beautiful colors that you see. It's much like if you were to try to wash off gasoline or oil on your driveway from water. The thin layer of oil creates this interference patterns of colors, like also the color in a hummingbird's feathers are all created by the way light scatters and interferes through different layers of the material. And so I happen to have an abalone shell in my garage. I didn't have a mother of pearl. And so I set myself the task of, I have a fret saw. Now, this is not the kind that the Chinese use. They use more of a circular saw that looked like a bow. But the beauty of this saw is that the blade can be removed from the armature and you drill a small hole through the shell. You then assemble the saw through the shell, and then you set yourself the task of carving out or sawing out all of the different forms with this fret saw or bow saw. So the first thing I did was I wanted to cut off a piece of the abalone with my fret saw, and you can see how I've released a small portion of it. Now, that shell is fairly thick. I think that shell is about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's pretty hard. A couple of weeks ago, Catherine Jones had given you a lecture on jade. Jade is so hard it cannot be cut with a saw or a knife. But abalone, in comparison, is you can cut with a saw. On the Mohs scale, it's about a 3.5. Jade is a 6.5, and diamond is a 10. But I understood that I needed to be able to cut thin layers of it, and I wasn't able to do it with a handsaw. I tried doing it with a Dremel drill, and when I did, the fumes that it released were the most awful smelling substance I'd ever smelled in my life. I would assume that the organic material that binds the calcium carbonate layers created this incredibly horrible smell that even with my N95 mask, it penetrated through the mask. And so I gave up. So in the dry technique, what one does is, again, you imagine the entire image and you cut out all of the little shapes that you're going to need. You apply the shape to the wood, and then you carefully outline it on your wooden board. Now, if you were a good student in kindergarten and you had your drawing book, remember you had to draw within inside the lines and paint inside the lines. That is even more true in inlay. You now have to set yourself the task of carving perfectly inside the line. You cannot touch the line when you're carving. Modern artists use, I've forgotten the word. Anyway, modern artists use different tools, but the ancient Chinese only had knives and chisels to do it with. So I got my knife and chisel set, and I started carving out the pocket that would hold the inlay. And eventually, when I got the depth enough, I applied the abalone shell to it. And I want you to see how poor of a job I did, because a true inlay, you could not actually see this rough, ugly boundary that I did. That again gives me an impression of the skill level of the artists. Now, again, my abalone was much thicker than they would have, but when I finished, I lacquered it, and that's the process of dry inlay. So the effort it took me to apply one piece gives me, again, an understanding of the incredible labor that goes into creating the beautiful works of art like this one. Here we see a Ming Dynasty box with literally hundreds of pieces of shell, very thin shell, that have been laid into the top. And in this case, not only do we have abalone and mother of pearl, but also there's gold inlay into this tray that we see here. The other techniques that are used with lacquer are lacquer over carved wood. Wood doesn't yield itself to the knife as easily as lacquer. So even though the artist here was able to carve these images into the wood, this is the lacquer is then applied over the top. This is a work of art that's in your collection. And here's another work from your museum, a piece of furniture with the carved, I believe this is rosewood, which is a prized wood, and then the lacquer is applied over the top. Again, the lacquer seals the wood. It makes it impervious to acids and water, and it's a really important material. And the last technique I just wanted to show you briefly is there are some painted images over lacquer. Some of the earliest use of lacquer goes all the way back to the Han Dynasty. And here we see black and red lacquer on a bowl, on a wooden bowl. And here we see oil paint. The lacquer would be first applied to the tray, then the painting would be executed on top of it, and then the clear lacquer would go over the top to seal it. Here's an example from your collection, I believe. And on these slides, I have some if they're available to you, some extra terms and words. And there's a bibliography with 2 videos if you wanted to see videos of these techniques demonstrated. So with that, I will unshare my screen.
Ray, this is Russell Lowe again. That was absolutely fascinating. I appreciate that, and thank you for your expertise. You know, as someone who really enjoys creating and making objects, I just am fascinated by what you learned and what you were able to execute. I have so many questions, but maybe we can hold off on some of those until after the presentation. But thank you so very, very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ray. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Andy Liu. His Chinese name is Lu Ping. He has been a collector of Chinese antiquities. He is an ambassador for Chinese heritage. We are fortunate enough that he is willing to showcase some of the items in his massive collection, the items of the precious lacquer. Ray has given you a beautiful presentation on how he made his humble little box of longevity, how he carved into the abalone shell to make an inlay. Now, let's open our eyes and give a warm welcome to Mr. Andy Liu. Andy, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. And also thanks for Ray's presentation. I really appreciate it. He liked to do the research on Chinese art. Really appreciate it. First of all, I try to briefly introduce lacquer culture to everybody. Lacquer in Chinese art or culture history is another shining chapter. First one I show is picture is for Hemudu culture, which is CC provided for me. This lacquer we find around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. Archaeology beside we find this one, and also we find a lot of seeds. So in other words, in that time, they know how to make the rice ball, and they also know how to plant rice. So it's amazing. And this is a class 1 protection object. So you cannot see this one in the outside the country. They don't let them go out to exhibition. Okay, let's go. This is not my collection. Okay, these are my collections. Okay, this is the Han Dynasty. The painting on the lacquer painting. So you can see these things is called a three-head phoenix. And what that means, I research something, maybe it's a lucky bird in that time. And this one is repaired, have been repaired quite a bit. And the other one is two phoenix in the center. That one is a few repaired, and I'm glad I have these things and in my collections. And the next I show you what it is three has phoenix means. Let me go next. Okay, so this is we find in the Chu Wenhua, Chu culture. Chu culture in China, very, very famous and in the top. In that time, they start so many stuffs. We see that, there are a lot of music, bronze instrument. It's all coming from that time. I talk about a famous Zheng Houyi Mu. Zheng Houyi is the guy's name. And his tomb, we find it, and he got a coffin, painted beautiful lacquer pictures. Really, really nice. Also, he got a 3-layer with the coffin. The first one is a stone. The second one is lacquer. In all these beautiful pictures, the inside, the third one for his body, they paint the North Star. So it's very interesting. In that time, he already researched meteorologists because it probably for the fight or something. The weather is very important. And these things I show you, is on the silk rope. They saw them on it. So I took these pictures. This is a CC find for me, you find out for me. So this tree has a phoenix. So you can see more detail on this one because my collection, I'm not a good photographer, so not really good pictures. Okay, let's go next. Okay. This is a lacquer screen. This screen is pretty big. It's about total is about 8 pieces. And you can see I have this stamp on it, the Shanghai Art and Design Research Center. I wrote a letter to the Shanghai Museum. I try to find out this screen because this screen is a very, very nice, amazing screen. So they wrote back to me. They told me some story. They say this is Shanghai Art and Design Research Center is after the Qing dynasty end, a lot of these people used to be working for the palace, and they lost job. They don't have job anymore, so they're going out. Maybe these kind of things, maybe they give to their children or something. But they organize this research center because they want to, to do something to get pay. So that's the they say. In that time they say it's top lacquer craftsman to do this screen. But unfortunately, I have this screen. I have these screens around 20 and plus years ago, and the guy told me is his uncle is a Navy captain. So when their ship called in Singapore 50 years ago, so his uncle bought this screen. After his uncle passed away, so he inherited it. He said the screen is so big and he don't have any place to put. So he keep in the garage. So it's pretty filthy, dirty, got a lot of, the painting on it. And lucky is not oil based, it's water based. So I can clean them up. And also in a lot of damages. So I find a furniture store, the guy to roughly repair a little bit. And not much you can repair, just and also, you can see this detail, this screen. They use the carving skill, but this carving is different regular. There's a straight carving down because they got so many layers in there. So you want to show the color. So they scratch the lacquer until he's satisfied the real color he wants. So you can see this one. You can see his rope, the green, and show the blue something under. So if you see the detail, you know he scratched them. The blues come up. And also this is the Chinese say is a whole tree. It's a good story about him, and he's the one who he shoot. Because in that time in China, they say the early time, thousand years ago, we have 10 suns, so there's no night. So people are so hot, and so it's so suffered. So this guy coming, he uses a arrow and a bow and shoot the 9 suns down. So only got one left. It's today's sun. This is a story, the nice story. So you can see from his weapon, he got one is this ball on the top. It's very interesting. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this is the whole screen. And these screens, not only the very good craftsmen, and also the topic is really great. This is 9个图. This means it's the first Chinese religions picture. Because these 9 of them, all the gods, you can see it, most of them all stand on the cloud. That means they are the gods, they are not regular people. They are not another world. In that time, they have a religion, a belief. What is there, say, like they go to the church, they don't have a church, so they eventually got some temples, for these things. So underneath the red one, that means it's a dragon, symbolic dragons. And also, I have to mention this, this technique, they're not used on the painting. I think a lot of people went to Xi'an to see the terracotta soldier. You know that all terracotta soldier originally is very colorful. After they off the ground, they change the color. And actually, how they can paint the color on the terracotta is very hard. If I have some Han Dynasty stuff, I know color will fade away. So all the 7,000 terracotta soldier in the Xi'an, they have a very thin lacquer on it. So you can see some of them is peeled. They put the lacquer first, let them dry, then put a color on it. That's why you can keep a long time. Like keep a couple thousand years, something like that. And also, this technique, carving these screenless things, European people really, really like it. You can see a lot of, the high-end French furniture. They inlaid this piece, this lacquer carving in their furniture. Because this is very expensive processing. So just really talk about, the beauty and the dangers. Because this lacquer is very poison. European people say, we move these things from China in that time, 18th century. The one voyage takes them about at least 4 to 5 months. If lucky, can make the voyage. Some of them are sunk in the Indian Ocean, around Jakarta area. So they try to plant the lacquer tree. So they're smart. They bought thousands of lacquer tree to try to plant in Europe. Then they can do it themselves. They don't need to through all these guys, traveling. And then they find out that the lacquer juice is very poison. Just like a Ray say, they make itches and they rotten, your skin start rotten, and you cannot breathe in. Besides that, all the lacquer trees die because they got some kind of insects like these lacquer trees. So that's what we call the ecosystem. So they give up. So they say, okay, we still, import from China. This thing just like, the 2 year tried to plant the rubber tree from bought the rubber tree from the Indonesia, Malaysia, and moved to Brazil. The same thing. Ecosystem, they never can make it. Okay, let's go next. Okay, these collections, inlaid, the box, they use the brown lacquer. And the inlaid these things. This is around the Yuan Dynasty. Because they like these kinds. You look like, the snowflake, I don't think they know the snowflake was look like in that time. Their imagination, they call the 皮球花, like a flower or the ball, because it's a round one. And it's a real nice, it's amazing. In the center is longevity. They carve the longevity. This ball is pretty big. I think it's around 20, 25 inches diameter. Let's go next. Okay, this is the end of the Qing dynasty, and in that time, the people very popular. They use the lacquer, inlay this lacquer for the rich families. They use these things, and the wines we call it, the wedding basket, and they all inlaid is mother pearl. So and the wine is a double happiness. So in that time, the writing double happiness is very long. They call it 九传字 in that time. And just like say, they're very popular, and but still it's very expensive in that time. And let's go next. Now you can see we open a box. You can see inside, dividing. You can put a candy in there because wedding basket. You can put a candy in there or something like that. When you go to the ceremony, after the ceremony, you can open. Everybody can have a candy, something like that. On the left side, I think it's a sewing box. You see the two phoenix around the sun. Usually in Chinese, it's simple. Phoenix indicate is a female. Dragon indicate male. That's why I think this probably is a sewing box. And that's why you got two phoenix on it. It's real nice and a lot of work. Just like we say, you saw the race work. This is a lot of work. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this is a Ming Dynasty. I find these things around 15, 18 years ago. You know, it's actually sell, and it's through on a corner because of broken leg. And I know this is a Ming Dynasty, so I bought them. And I find the furniture store fix for me. And it's real nice. You can see in that time, the Ming Dynasty, they're working, and there's so many, the small things. And at this game, they use the technique, they probably use some sea snails shell, the inlay, the skin. I will explain to you later on this one. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this is a little box. Really show you before. This color, the she contain TC. That means translated to the real Chinese words is carving, Reno carving. Why you call it Reno carving? That's a long story, because in the warrior state, the people like the Reno's belly button. The belly button usually after the Reno die, the belly button look like this. They usually carve them a circle, they like a decoration for the warrior or something on their the bell. That's why they call it the P. That means is the Reno carving. Then you can see all the layers, just like a Ray say, every layer it take a long, long time to let them dry out. By the way, in Chinese, I went to visit the lacquer manufacturer, in China. I visited them. They say that this lacquer, every layer they do it, they put in the basement pipe, and they also spread the water in there, keep it a very high humidity to avoid the crack. That's why it take a long time for the 200, at least a 200 or 250 layers to able to carve it. Okay, let's go next. This is a snot bottle. It's in that time, the snot bottle used to be is from the Europe in the middle of the Ming Dynasty. From the original is put in the box of the tobacco box, small box. It's real nice, And the Chinese then changed it. The box is too big, So they developed this snap box, snap bottle. And the later time, so the rich people, they try to show the people the different classifications. They show you the snap bottle. What do you got, You got is lacquers, I got is gold, you got is J, or you have some kind of other stuff, or the horn, the hornbill, and also you got some, like porcelain. Some porcelain is real nice. It's very, very hard to make, even small one. And also they got most of got is glass. They call the liao qi. Glass one, they got a very famous was inside paint. And that inside paint it take a long, long, long time to achieve one. And some of them is a famous artists. That bottle is cost really, really expensive for today. You got about 3 or 4 famous inside painting by the star bottles. It's very hard to find the real ones, not imitated. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this boxes, I believe is Yuan Dynasty or early Ming, because you can see from here the carving. In that time, the carving, just like a Ray show you a Song Dynasty. That's even earlier. This kind of box don't have the base. They don't have the base carving. They simply have the flower or this is carving. And you can see, compare this one and the Song Dynasty's difference. Song Dynasty, you still can see a lot of base. You can see the wood or something like that. But in Yuan Dynasty, from their we call it, the cobalt blue vase, when they're painting, they are full. They don't have too many space in the porcelain. Yuan Dynasty porcelain. They're carving like cover them all by the pictures. Okay, they don't have any base carving, and this is a great piece. I think because I like it because of the whole things, and you can different other carving, like garden scenes or something like that. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this is my collection. This is the Qing dynasties. They imitate the bronze. The bronze is in Chinese art is the most important position in Chinese art because a lot of them based on the bronze. Because bronze is not only art, it's only owned by the emperor or the law. They use it for the ceremony, and also a lot of bronze have the uh, letter on it. So they tell us a lot of story on it. So the bronze is a very, very important position in the Chinese art. So later on, like Song Dynasty, they imitate a lot of their porcelain based on the bronze. And this one is based on the bronze, Ding, we call it. It's a real nice. And you can see from his carving, now they're carving the basic carving now. It's like a square, so we can identify this is Qing dynasties. Because like a Ming dynasty is a little bit different. It's like a rectangular, longer one. So this is another story because they have a book talk about these things. Very complicated. You can tell what year, what times, what you can identify the time for you. And let's go next. Okay, this is middle of the Qing dynasty. So this one is different. I show you the first one, the screen. So this one is a carving. After the carving, they just put a color in there. Like painting, use the brush to paint the color inside the carve. So you can see it's a very shallow, and you can see the colors are very even. This technique is different. The first one I show you, that is very, very hard because you have to scratch the color, show another layer color, and mix them together. Before you do it, you have to have a plan. What kind of color layer by layer together, Okay, let's go to the next. Okay, this is my last collections. And you see, this is a very beautiful one. This is come from the sea snail. They got a special sea snail. It's very colorful. And in that time, it's almost, they say the late Qing in that time, even in that time, it's very rare. Because only few craftsmen know how to do it. Because they use some kinds of water, mix something with soft sea snail. They got one kind of sea snail, inside is very colorful. I never saw the sea snail, but this is the book told me, I never saw the regular sea snail. It's a very, very colorful. And they take the inside the skin out. That's a very difficulty, And also, this is always the family secret. So nobody else know how to do these things. They always do this and they always close the door, they're doing there. And they say they're soaking their problem before days until you can workable. They take this very, very thin layer out, then cut a piece and pull out. This is a snap bottle. See, and the head, you can take them out. No, the thickest, the thickest, the head, that's the top. You can open it. And but these things is very, very rare. I don't see this in too many. And the ratio as last lacquer presentation, the garden sea, they got some gold leaves in there. That picture, I think the rest is a sea snail also. Look, it's very colorful. It's different than the regular mother pearl. And these things, the just like a loss of art, and even the screen, I never saw that one later. I never saw the other place have that kind of stuff anymore. Probably another loss of art. But we need to raise people, to research and find out what the heck it is, So, okay, and this is my last one. And thank you very much. And